Menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle is a cycle of thickening of the endometrium in the uterus lining caused by hormones once in every 28 days. Menstrual cycle occurs when a girl hits puberty and the cycle never stops until she reaches menopause. Menstrual cycle occurs in the female genital tract, mainly involving the ovaries and uterus. A complete menstrual cycle consists of ovarian cycle and uterine cycle that happen simultaneously. The ovarian cycle focuses on the development of ovary and is divided into three phases, which are follicular phase, ovulation phase, and luteal phase. The uterine cycle focuses on the formation of the endometrium and is divided into four phases, which are menstrual phase, proliferative phase, ovulation phase, and secretory phase.
Let's start with the first phase of ovarian cycle. It is the follicular phase between the first day of period to the end of ovulation. First, we start in ovary. After puberty, maturation of follicles is controlled by pituitary hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. It begins with the releasing gonadotrophin hormone by hypothalamus that will stimulate enteropituitary gland to secrete FSH and LH. When FSH reaches a certain level, it will stimulate growing of follicle in ovary. Results in a number of follicles will compete to reach ovulation. Ovarian follicle is a fluid-filled sac in ovary that is made up of primary oocyte and surrounded by theca cells and granulosa cells. The theca cells develop LH receptors in response to secrete large amount of androstenedione hormone. Granulosa cells will develop FSH receptors and bind with FSH hormone, which stimulate production of enzyme aromatase that convert androstenedione into 17-beta-estradiol or estrogen. These follicles will become mature follicle and stimulate the growing follicle to secrete estrogen. Simultaneously, this process begins with the uterine phase on the first day of menses, when no fertilization occurs. In this phase, estrogen and progesterone hormone levels are low. As you can see, these are the few physical changes of cervix that help to remove the thickened lining of old endometrium wall. During this phase, mucus blood, which mainly comes from the acute, basal, and spiral arteries, come out from uterus. Blood clots, tissues, as well as an unfertilized ovum. Next, what cells can be observed under the microscope in a pap smear? During the first to fifth day of uterine phase, these are the cells that can be observed. Following that, proliferative phase occurs where the uterus prepares for lining and maintenance of endometrium, during which increasing estrogen, or specifically 17-beta-estradiol that stimulates thickening of endometrial layer, increasing growth of endometrial glands, stroma, and emergence of spiral arteries. Back to observation under the microscope. These are the cells that can be observed during day 6 to day 14 of proliferative phase. As the phase progresses to the end of day 10 to 14, increasing 17-beta-estradiol provide negative feedback to pituitary gland to inhibit secretion of FSH and stimulate the secretion of LH for ovulation to take place.
Ovulation phase occurs on day 14, which is the middle of menstrual cycle that divides the follicular phase and luteal phase in ovarian cycle. Graphian follicle bursts and releases the secondary oocyte from the ovary, which is then collected by the fallopian tube to be fertilized if sperms are present. Ovulation or follicle rupture takes place 28 to 36 hours after the onset of the LH surge and 10 to 12 hours after LH reaches its peak. LH surge induces an acute inflammatory-like reaction, which is surely needed to induce the follicle to rupture. The increase of progesterone with estrogen at its peak causes the walls of the uterus to continue thickening for preparation of a fertilized egg. So, what are the physical changes when ovulating? Or in other words, what are the fertile signs to look out for? The most obvious sign is a change in vaginal discharge. Approaching ovulation, the cervix moves up higher. Also, an individual will have an increase in basal body temperature. What cells are under the microscope during this short phase of ovulation? Firstly, there will be an observation of predominant intermediate squamous cells and a relative number of superficial squamous cells.
Now let's take a look at post-ovulation. At this point, luteal phase occurs, which is the time between ovulation and before the start of menstruation, or when the body prepares for possible pregnancy, from day 15 to day 28 of ovarian cycle. During this phase, the follicle ruptures and becomes empty after releasing the egg. Then it transforms into corpus luteum and starts to produce progesterone and estrogen. Progesterone levels peak about halfway through this phase. This triggers the uterus to enter the secretory phase in uterine cycle, where the endometrium prepares for possible fertilization. The increase of progesterone causes the endometrium to thicken and be filled with fluids and nutrients in order to support a possible embryo, also causing the uterine glands to secrete more cervical mucus, making it less likely for sperm to enter the uterus. If a pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum produces progesterone until about 10 weeks gestation, which keeps the corpus luteum to stay alive. In contrast, if there are no embryo implants, the circulating levels of hormone decline and the corpus luteum gradually degenerates into the corpus albicans. Therefore, when progesterone and estrogen reach its lowest level, the spiral arteries collapse, hence the new menstrual cycle starts to begin. So, what type of cell can be observed under the microscope here? We may observe intermediate cells from clusters or clumps and cytolysis of intermediate cells by Dodolin lactobacilli.
In conclusion, menstrual cycle is important as it helps for the preparation of uterus for the implantation of zygote. Second, for the ovulation process to occur when the secondary oocyte is fertilized. Third, for the menstruation to occur if the secondary oocyte is not fertilized. And lastly, for the regulation of hormones.